Hi, welcome to the Worthy Physician Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Sapna Shah-Hawk, a board-certified internal medicine physician. In this episode, I sat down and talked with Dr. Diane Shannon, an internist by training, who shares her journey of burnout, how the system left multiple holes, and she was not able to deliver patient care the way she had envisioned. She changed her narrative and is now coaching physicians through burnout. She shares tips and tricks, as well as revisiting the definition of burnout and how to delegate things to offload and to create a joyful existence again. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Glad to be here.
So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Diane Shannon, and I am today a physician coach. I specifically help women coaches with the challenges that they tend to face.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I got here is a little bit of a roundabout story. My mother was a midwife, and that was watching her career and her interactions and relationships with her patients is what inspired me to want to be in healthcare. And what I found was when I got into the clinical years in medical school, the structure wasn't really set up to support the kind of relationships that I saw that my mother had had. And so I started questioning how could this be better, or why isn't it a different situation where that relationship between the care provider and the patient is really the center focus and is really protected and prioritized. But I continued and got into residency training and really enjoyed my time with patients, but continued to be really concerned about the fact that it didn't feel like that relationship was foremost. Mm-hmm. I also found myself really worried about the patient safety issues that I saw. This was before the Institute of Medicine released their report. And I really noticed that there were places where things fell through the cracks, or the potential for things to fall through the cracks. So it might be a lab result that wasn't checked, or the system kind of had breakdowns, or communication in terms of a referral, or making sure the referral happened. And so I found myself worrying a lot and using a lot of workarounds to protect my patients and try to fill in the gaps and make the system more reliable. And I eventually did go on to practice. I practiced general internal medicine in the Boston area, tried a number of different settings, and found that there wasn't one that really felt right for me. So I kept trying to make it work, and it didn't. And just to go back, I did experience pretty severe burnout during residency. I kind of just pushed myself through and said, just get through this year, just get through the next year, just take your boards. So really through just grit, got myself through it. But when I thought, at that point, when I'd been practicing for a couple of years, I thought, I don't see a way right now to prevent burnout happening again to me. And I don't see a way to create a system that's reliable, where I can be certain that patient safety issues aren't going to be an ongoing concern for me. And so, again, this was many years ago. This was 25 or more years ago. And I didn't see any other options except to either stay in burnout again or to leave. And so I chose to leave the profession. It wasn't an easy decision. And I eventually moved into medical writing and worked at a communications company for 3 years. And while I was there, I was really lucky and learned how to write and to edit, and decided that that's what I wanted to focus on. And so I started a freelance writing business and did that for 20 years, roundabout. During the course of that, I ended up working with a coach because I was having some stresses in my personal life around a divorce, being a single parent of children at that point. How do I remake my career now that it needs to really, I need to support us. And so I started working with a coach, and she really helped me to have some insights about what I really wanted and where I was getting in my own way. And that kind of opened things up for me in terms of having the courage to share my story about burnout.
Mm-hmm.
When I did, physicians began contacting me to say, oh my gosh, I didn't know anyone else had experienced this. And I found that so motivating and inspiring that I continued to turn my career towards writing at that point, writing about burnout and how to prevent it. Wrote a book with another physician that focuses on the system issues that drive physician burnout. As part of that, I was exposed to a coaching program where groups of coaches went through, and really I saw this incredible impact of coaching. So that's what inspired me to become a coach, and that gets me full circles so that I feel really inspired to do what I do, because I am trying to prevent the situation that led me to leave the profession. And it feels just so rewarding to be there and to see the physicians I work with really make changes that create, sustainable careers and lives that they really love.
That's amazing, because this was 20 plus years ago and it's just now coming to the forefront.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And back then there was nobody talking about physician burnout or physician wellness or coaching or mentoring or any of that. It really was pretty much, sink or swim. And so honestly, for years, I carried this shame about the fact that I couldn't hack it. That was how I interpreted what had happened. And it was only working with a coach that I was able to see, actually, I was really courageous to make a decision to leave something that wasn't working and create something that would work for me. But again, it took years and the help of a professional to get to that point.
But kudos to you for having that courage and that insight to say, this isn't working. I need to rework this. And of course, life has its way of putting that fire under our tails to make us move.
Yes, right.
But that's amazing, because you were way ahead of the curve.
Well, I'll tell you, it felt like a pretty dark time, honestly. I did not feel like I was a trailblazer. I felt like, oh gosh, like after, and I think I've run into this with some other physicians that I've worked with, this sense that I have put so much time and energy into this profession,
right,
into being trained. I owe it to myself and to society and to other people and the patients and my colleagues. I have to stay. And I do think that if there's any way to reshape the exact practice environment you're in, or reshape the organization you're in, or move to a different organization to be able to stay in clinical practice, great. Like, let's figure out how to do that. And if not, then let's figure out some way that you can use everything that you know in another realm. And so that's what I appreciate about my experiences. I can say now, I do use everything I learned in order to do what I do.
Sure. So you might have left clinical medicine, but you're helping physicians help themselves by finding a sustainable way to make a living, or to fulfill this calling or vocation that they have. So that's awesome.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, it is like the best job ever. Like, to be able to witness physicians figure out what they really want, what's in the way, and then set goals and move toward them. And just to see the relief that they experience when they move to something that actually works for them. It's really gratifying.
I can only imagine. And so that really cuts down on, hopefully, the suicide rate, because we know that physicians, between 300 and 400 a year.
Yes.
Women physicians are more likely to be successful compared to the male counterparts, which is scary. And so what do you think from the clients you've had, what do you think adds to, and you've written about it, what adds to burnout besides the corporatization of healthcare and the disconnect of what we embody as a physician, maybe going into medical school, going through residency, and then coming out in the culture being completely different. What are some of the major contributors that you see?
Yeah, so the ones you mentioned are definitely way up there.
Right.
I think another one that's been true from the beginning, it was true when I was training and in practice, is the lack of reliability in the system. So in other words, our healthcare system was not designed with the goal of being 100% reliable, as in what you want to happen happens. So patient safety issues, like there are ways of preventing those, right? Or communication, making sure there are no gaps. Again, if you're a primary care physician and you refer a patient, that whole process where the referral, the consultation happens, and then the information gets to the patient and also back to the primary care physician, and then there's communication. Like that whole cycle, we right now can't depend on that happening. There are places where there are potential gaps. So the system was never designed to be reliable. It just kind of fell into place and pieces were added and additional services were added. But again, it wasn't built from the beginning with that sense of being reliable. So I think that's a big part. The other thing, there's so many, but another big one I think is the amount of kind of administrative tasks that the physician is now charged with doing. Mm-hmm. And I saw a statistic that the inbox messaging has gone up 150% since in the past year and a half. So part of that is the CARES Act, where patients have now direct, immediate access to lab results, mm-hmm. right? And so their messaging, even before the physician has a chance to maybe see the labs, right? So there's that piece, and then all the questions that go along with COVID, right, and the pandemic. So that amount has increased at the same time that there is a workforce shortage. So there are fewer nurses, there are fewer medical assistants, fewer people who can triage and help with some of that added burden. And so I think those are some of the biggest pieces that I hear about, and they spill over in terms of work-life balance, so that physicians are then thinking, okay, do I work 4 days a week and my day off is actually catching up, or do I do 2 hours of work every night, or do I stay late and miss dinner with my family, or work on the weekends, or get up at 5 a.m. or 4 a.m., so they're scurrying to try to find ways to make this work when it's just so that the workload is huge.
Right. And you're still liable as the physician, because I'm general internal med. You're liable for that, even if it's your time off.
Right.
So you're really never off the clock.
Right. And that, when you think about us as human beings and what we need some time to recharge. We need some time to be off devices, or to just be able to focus on our family, or focus on self-care, exercise, whatever that means, right? It
Absolutely.
makes sense that we as animals, right, we need that.
Yes, we're social creatures. And even though there's a lot of interaction with humans, other humans as physicians, it's a very different pecking order. It's a very different relationship.
Right. Exactly. And what I've seen is that, especially, working with the women physicians that I work with, they are so busy between working at work and working at home that often they feel very isolated, because they don't have the breathing room to connect with another physician to say, hey, what's your experience? Or how are you dealing with this? Or how are you doing? And right. So it can be very lonely and isolating.
Right. I mean, I've had this talk with some of my male colleagues. Different specialties, different generations. The outlook has changed, I believe. Thank God. But there is a disconnect, I think, evolutionarily speaking, about, and I'm not saying that the men that go into medicine are not good dads. I'm not saying that. But there's this drive that as as females, as women, as mothers, you really want to be there and try to do everything that you can as a mom, and then as a physician, and you feel guilty if you can't. It's almost, and it's not that society will shame you, but it's, I think, more self-shaming. We have to remember that back 100 years ago, it probably was not a one-person show. It was a village.
And that guilt between the sense of, I should be doing more at work, I should be doing more at home, right? Wherever you are, it's like you should be somewhere else. Like,
right.
I hear that a lot.
We have a lot of extended family where we live, so we pull them in. My kids love it. One thing I've been okay with is delegating different tasks. And yes, small things like having somebody cut the lawn or having somebody doing pre-prepped meals. It just takes time off my plate. I have 2 happy minions and I have a great work-life balance.
Right.
So how do you coach your clients in that way? Or what are some of the biggest pieces of advice that you say, hey, let's take a look at this?
Well, I will just say that as a coach, I don't give advice.
Gotcha.
What I do is I really help the person I'm working with to first identify what they really, really want, what's really not working, right? Mm-hmm. So get a lot of clarity. And with the folks I work with over a span of time, I do personality assessments and assessments about imposter syndrome and highly sensitive people and some others to really give them a sense of, this is who I am, here are my strengths, here are the places where I might get derailed under stress. So really understanding that and their goals. And then, we work on creating some pretty clear topics or focus or challenges that we work on during the period of time we're working together, and mm-hmm. set very simple metrics so that we can track how we're doing. So that might be, my goal is to be home by 6:30. And we kind of track, okay, to do that, let's go upstream. What would that require you to do differently, right? And so they set very specific goals. I call them experiments, because really it's about, okay, let's try this. How did it work? If it worked, great. If it didn't work, okay, let's rejigger it. What could you do differently? And part of that, what comes out in those experiments, is really beginning to see where sometimes we have a fixed mindset about something, and that's actually getting in our way.
Right.
Right. So one of them might be, oh, but I can't hire someone to clean my house. Right.
Yeah.
So like working through that, getting some more insight about, well, what is that about? Is that, or another one that comes up commonly is notes taking a fair amount of time, and this realization that there's a piece of perfectionism in there about the notes, about how the grammar is or how the format is of the notes, things that don't matter clinically. And so in exposing and bringing to light that perfectionism and what are the costs of that, what are the benefits of it and what are the costs of it, then quite often people are able to do something differently. But until it's like raised and there's some awareness of what it is that's actually going on, right, then it's so easy to just keep doing the same thing and getting the same result. So that's what, and as I said, if there's something where I have a personal or, professional background in, I will say, okay, I'm taking off my coaching hat now and I'm putting on my training hat. And
gotcha.
Then I'll give a piece of suggestion that I've seen or I've read or something that I've written about. But I really try to keep coaching to this idea that I am not the expert in you. You
right.
are the expert in you, but I'm the expert in the framework of that coaching conversation. And that's my job.
That's a really good way to phrase it. And so do you see a lot of your clients coming in at one particular stage of burnout where they're about ready to leave the profession completely, or are your clients kind of at the beginning of burnout saying this isn't working, or are they kind of all over the spectrum?
I'd say it's a range, and
Yeah.
there are some that are really, and I would say in the past, let's say 4 to 6 months, I've seen an uptick in the number who had severe burnout.
Wow.
Whereas before, yes, but I think you have a handful of folks who are at the point of like, actually, you need to take time off. Like, clearly your physician is telling you that, right? There's, you are exhausted, you are not sleeping, whatever. Like, their physical manifestations that were so severe of burnout that they ended up having to take some amount of time away. I had not seen that level of severity prior to the past 6 months.
Sure. And you've been coaching for how long?
4 years now.
Really?
Yep.
Wow. And so I'm sure that you've seen the spectrum. What are some of the warning signs you would say somebody needs to think about pushing the pause button? And I know that that's kind of a vague question, but I think the more times we hear it from somebody who has been there, from somebody who is a physician, it validates it and says it's okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the official definition of burnout. Right?
Sure.
So this comes from the research in the 1970s by Christina Maslach and other folks. So first is emotional exhaustion, completely spent. There's nothing left in your tank. They've also expanded that more recently to include physical and cognitive exhaustion. And there's more studies that have looked at the brains of physicians with burnout and seeing changes on MRI that relate to cognitive exhaustion or cognitive overload. The next is depersonalization. So that is kind of a distancing from the emotional parts of one's job. And what I found so interesting about this and so reassuring to me personally was that it turns out depersonalization is a coping mechanism for dealing with extreme exhaustion at work. So when we get so burned out, the exhaustion part, but we want to keep working, what we do is we separate ourselves from the emotions of it. And so that could look like cynicism or seeing patients as yet another case. But I saw that in myself, and it was reassuring years later to learn, oh, that's actually part of this. It's a component of burnout. It wasn't that I had become an insensitive person.
Right.
And the last is inefficacy, which is just this sense that no matter what you do, it doesn't matter. You're not really making a difference. And that can come from and also compound the other components of burnout. In terms of what to look for, I mean, that's very helpful. In my experience, one of the big clues is irritability. Like, I have physicians come in and they say, I'm just so irritable at work, or I'm irritable at home.
Mm-hmm.
And that shows up as, being short with the nurse that I'm working with. And I don't want to be, but I just got so frustrated, right? Or at home, I just, my kids come to me and they want to do homework, but I'm in the middle of trying to do something and I just get so frustrated and I don't want to be irritable with them. So that's a big one. I think fatigue, lack of interest in work. Another big one is feeling dread going into work. That kind of, there's also another one that comes up a fair amount, which is hopelessness at getting through the charting. And so often when people get to a certain number of open charts, there's this hopelessness that sets in, and it feels like you're never going to catch up and you can't do anything to fix that problem. And you're just like spinning your wheels. And the more you spin, the more exhausted you get, and the more inefficient you get at finishing your charts. So it can be real catch-22. So those are some of the big tips that or signs that I've seen with the physicians that I work with.
Sure. And I appreciate that. I don't know what that number is, but I think it's going to vary on probably specialty and complexity.
Yes.
And number two, I appreciate the fact that you brought up not just being irritable at work, but irritable at home, because a lot of the references I see to burnout is at work, but there's no way to separate that work self from the home self.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. From coaching, how long do you coach a physician, or does it depend on their level of need?
What I have found is that 4 months is a good amount of time that most people with what we're working on, that's a good span,
Mm-hmm.
a good term for engagement. Some people were not quite finished and then they will will extend a bit. And when I first started coaching, I thought it was going to be 6 months, but I found that people were finishing sometimes and happy with where they were at 4 or 5 months. So that's why I now have that shorter span of time. And that, I feel like that is a good amount of time to like get to know them, to have them, go through some of the assessments, learn more about what they want, and then go through that process with me of that kind of iterative process of trying something, trying an experiment, coming back, trying something different, and then having that accountability over time. The other thing that I really like is that we create these very simple metrics, like my satisfaction with my level of work-life balance, on a scale of 1 to 10. And
Mm-hmm.
at midway through, and then at the end, we go back and I ask them the questions again, whatever those metrics are that we're tracking. And I think it's so helpful because often they'll say, oh, I remember now how I felt. I do feel better. I do feel like I'm more confident, or I'm less anxious, or I'm more clear on what I want to do next. And so being able to kind of track that, I think, is really helpful.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you refer to it as an experiment, because it's elimination of what works and what doesn't,
Right.
and then comparing where you are to where you were,
Yes.
and the steps through which you go to look at the client and really look at the personality and define their needs, or help them define their needs, is
Mm-hmm.
quite extensive. So it's objective instead of just this is where I'm at and I'm a hot mess, help me.
Yes.
So I'm sure that probably gives a physician very type A personality more often than not, somebody that needs that knowledge to hang their hat on. That's just the way we're trained.
Yes.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, and it's been interesting too to see where physicians there are some areas where physicians have very similar results in terms of personality, and
Right.
places where it's very different. One of them that comes up every time is high altruism, right?
Right.
And that is, of course, like we would not be attracted to this profession if we didn't want to help others who were in need, right?
Right. Yes. And I think that gets lost through so much of training of our day-to-day life. And then, of course, the general public, the way that they view physicians, which none of us went in it for the money. It's because we wanted to help people, and we
Right.
still do. So, for the listener, how could they get a hold of you if they were interested in a coach?
Yep. Um, well, probably the easiest way is to check out my website, which is dianeshannon.com. Very
Mm-hmm.
easy. I'm also on LinkedIn and have uh, a lot of my writing ends up also on Kevin MD. And so those are places where you can find me. I'm also on Instagram. But really, if you want to see more about me and my writing about what I do, so probably LinkedIn and my website are the best places.
Yes, that would be fantastic. And you do focus on burnout, is that correct? Through your
Yes.
writing?
Yes. In my writing, I focus on burnout and both, and also this idea of what, burnout is driven by system factors. And at the same time, we individuals play a role in our well-being. So
Yes.
what is the interface between those two? And
Yes.
there are ways of kind of addressing both of them and doing both together. And so I really, because I have this experience of, writing this book with another physician about the system factors, I'm always thinking about how do the system factors play in with what's going on with this individual that I'm working with. And also, where can they make a difference in their own lives? Like, where is the agency, and helping them to have greater insight about the part that they play or the part they could play in their well-being.
Absolutely, because if we wait for the system to change, we're going to lose a lot of colleagues.
Yes.
And we're going to see a lot of disgruntled physicians.
Yes.
So I do agree that the system has to change. That's at a systemic level. I cannot change, but hopefully by waking up some of our colleagues, that can change in the next, I would say, decade, maybe. Maybe that's being too optimistic. But I love what you're saying. And what is the title of your book that identifies system issues?
Mm-hmm. It's called Preventing Physician Burnout, Curing the Chaos and Returning Joy to the Practice of Medicine. And I wrote it with my writing partner, Paul Dechant, who's another physician who has leadership, C-suite level leadership experience as well. So we kind of wrote it from two different perspectives coming together.
That's fascinating. I just think it's so important to not only look at what we see as a physician, but also the system errors or the system issues, because there's so many viewpoints that feed into what we now know as medicine.
Yes.
And so I appreciate your time and your expertise and you sharing your experience. And from one internist to another, you're always an internist at heart.
Yep.
What advice or what pearls would you have for the listener?
I would say, if you feel like your life is looking like it's a horse, like careening away from you, and you feel just overwhelmed or uncertain or exhausted, stop and do something about it, right? Access help from a coach, a mentor, talk to a colleague, but don't wait until it gets to the point of severe burnout. There are ways to change, and there's so much that you can do that really will improve how your daily life experience feels.
It's okay to get help. It's okay to check that box when we go to renew our license that said, I sought mental help. Because at the end of the day, if it prevents you from doing something to harm yourself and it keeps you around for your family, that's a win.
Absolutely.
Because we know that in medicine, they'll replace us within an hour. We've seen it happen. Family, you can't replace family members.
You can't replace family members. And honestly, at some point, we are going to run out of physicians.
Right.
Whether it's through attrition or through suicide. Right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Subscribe, tell a friend, follow us at www.theworthyphysician.com.
Start again the second time.